Hi, everyone. Welcome to IdeaScale's very first CEO Chats. I'm Megan Wright, your co-host for this series where we explore trends, tools, and tactics driving innovation. So each week, our featured host, IdeaScale CEO Nick Jain, will share his expertise and insights on the topic shaping the future of innovation. So to kick us off here, Nick will be diving into highlights from IdeaScale's 2024 Government Innovation Summit, an event that was packed with forward-thinking ideas and strategies. So Nick, let's go ahead and start there. What are the most impactful takeaways from the summit, and how do you see them influencing government innovation in the months ahead?
Perfect. Thanks so much for the warm intro, Lizzie, and really excited to start off this series. As you mentioned, we had IdeaScale had its government innovation summit about 6 or 7 weeks ago. Had government leaders from a bunch of different agencies, and that was hosted by you and my colleague Tim Sussman. I think there were three things that I took away, and I was kind of listening and watching from the background there. Number one, this was right before the election, and despite nobody knowing who was going to win, the government leaders there were civil servants who really focused on doing what's right for their constituents or their agencies, regardless of whether there was going to be continuing or a change in political administration. That was kind of really cool to see. Number two, been this broader trend over the last 5 to 6 years of government being much more measurement oriented around whether they're making a difference. And this is adopting some of the impact measurement techniques that they've taken from nonprofit organizations such as Robin Hood, which is a well-known nonprofit in New York City, or the Poverty Action Lab, which was run by Nobel laureate Esther Duflo. I actually worked for them right out of college. And these organizations had this idea that whether it be governments or nonprofits should be measuring the impact of their services in the same way that a private sector organization measures ROI. And that was the other thing that I saw. Like a lot of the government leaders were talking about measuring the outcomes, not just assuming that they were actually helping people. And that's a really good trend for society, especially as we start now increasing thinking about government efficiency. And then third, there was this really interesting acknowledgement by these government leaders that they know they work within constraints that private sector organizations don't. Those could be budgetary constraints, political constraints, bureaucratic constraints. And they know that these constraints exist. They know that they're bound by them, but they still want to be innovative despite that. And they figure out ways how to do this either by partnering with private sector organizations or trying to actually change the constraints that they work under, so that they can actually be more innovative and not stuck to doing things, let's say, the way they were done 20, 30, 50 years ago.
Great. Thanks so much for those insights, Nick. And it's really exciting to see how innovation is shaping the future of government. So, speaking of the future, one of the biggest challenges in technology today is ensuring that it's fair and equitable. So, let's talk about the crucial topic of addressing bias in AI. So, Nick, how do you see this issue impacting innovation, and what steps do you think that organizations can take to tackle it?
Sure. So I love AI, by the way, as anybody, as everybody at IdeaScale knows, I use it, and having conversations with my wife, prepping to take care of my child, making business decisions. So I love AI. But at the same time, I'm super cognizant of both its intellectual limitations as well as some of these biases. And I'll start by giving a really personal example. About a year ago, I wanted to play around with some of the image generation AI, and I said, can you generate an image of an Indian tech CEO? I'm ethnically Indian. I run a tech company. I wanted to see what image it would come up with, and it came up with some really photorealistic images. Except there were kind of fun, a couple funny things. Number one, every one of the 8 images that came out were male. Okay, and I hadn't specified male. It just assumed all Indian tech CEOs, 8 for 8, are male. Number two, every one of them was overweight. There's this bias in this AI that every single Indian tech CEO is overweight. And that's funny because, again, sticking with Indian tech CEOs, you have like Satya Nadella or at Microsoft, or I'm blanking on the Google CEO's name. They're ethnically Indian but skinny. And then you had Indira Nooyi, who's the former CEO of PepsiCo, who was a woman. So that was a clear bias that the AI was assuming certain physical and gender characteristics. And what's disappointing to see is, as recently as 3 weeks ago, some of those same biases still exist. I actually asked the exact same question, and a year later, even though we've heard about all the problems of biases in these technologies, they still exist. So that's a really personal example about how I was affected by some of the biases in this AI. And I think that there's two or three things organizations can do to address them. Number one, have someone, if your organization is using these AI tools to make critical business decisions, have someone who actually understands the technology from a technical perspective, who understands what hallucinations are, who understands what prompt engineering is, who understands bias and training sets. It's okay. Look, if you're just using these AI tools to play around, it doesn't matter. But if you're using them for critical business decisions, like who to give credit loans to in a mortgage, who to give jobs to, you need someone who actually understands what's under the hood of these black box technologies. Number two, understand where these technologies are good and where they're not. These technologies, for example, are good on data that is similar to the training sets that they've seen. So if they've only been trained on, let's say, photographic images of people in North America, that may not work as well for folks in Asia or in Africa. That's very common in image recognition technologies, where often there's a massive racial bias on the technology, on the images that these photo recognition technologies are trained on, so they can't be applied in certain situations. And number three, actively measure the bias, right? As with it, whenever you adopt any new technology, you should measure its performance. In the case of AI, again, I love these technologies. They can do really cool things, but a lot of organizations are not active. They're only thinking about the good stuff these technologies do, and they aren't measuring where these technologies fall down. You should be measuring, are these technologies biased? Are they, for using loans, using mortgage loans as an example, are they discriminating against a certain ethnic group or gender group or certain geography in ways that are not only bad for your business, but are perhaps illegal?
That's a really interesting example that you used there with the AI image generation, and I'll be interested to see how that progresses. We know that AI has progressed so much even in these past couple of years. So it's interesting that you checked back in with it a couple weeks ago as well, and I'll be interested to see if that changes in the future when we again use that exact example. So those were some really great insights, Nick. Tackling bias is such an important step towards creating more inclusive and more impactful solutions. So before we wrap up today, I want to switch gears and talk about innovation on a more practical level as well. So Nick, what's one tip that you'd share with our audience to help them spark innovation in their own organizations?
I think the biggest piece of advice I would give is go learn a new skill, whether it's an individual or as an organization. And there's two benefits. One is just at a human level, you probably feel good when you learn a new skill, and that new skill could be painting, it could be carpentry, it could be programming. But then specifically for innovation, either at an individual level or at an organization level, there's a huge benefit to learning new skills. And the reason is because innovation, if you actually look at the research, innovation is not just something that you don't, it's not a eureka moment in the bathtub. It doesn't come out of the abyss or out of the ether. True innovation, and if you look throughout human history, it's not coming out of the ether, but rather it is a new permutation of existing ideas. It is people taking disconnected ideas from different fields and applying them in a new context. And you can't take disparate ideas from new other fields if you actually haven't looked at those other fields, right? If you've never done carpentry and you've never used a hammer, you don't know that you could maybe use a hammer to solve a problem in your context. And I'll give a really like practical example. So there's this children's toy called a buckyball. It's this little Lego-like ball that expands and contracts for anybody who's played with it. It looks like a sphere, it's hollow, and it just you can pull it in and out, and it can expand in volume something like 100x. That's a really cool toy. Um, what's actually cool is somebody looked at that toy because their child was playing with that toy, and they said, "Hey, wouldn't it be cool if we built a molecule that did this?" And they did. They've made a molecule called carbon 60, C60, that literally is designed to look like the child's toy. And this C60 is so cool because it's strong. It's as strong as diamond. It has some amazing properties. You can use it in nanoconductors. And these chemical engineers literally came up with this idea because they looked at a children's toy and said, "Hey, why don't we do that in molecular chemistry?" And that's a classic way of how really cool, of how most innovation actually happens. People take ideas that have been developed in disparate fields, permute them in interesting ways, and then apply them to a new context to solve a problem or to approach a problem in a different way than has been done before. And that results in a lot of different, well, it results in candidly all innovation is just applying old disparate ways in new contexts.
That is a really interesting example. I love that. That reminds me of an example from a previous IdeaScale webinar we've done with NASA with Steve Rader, the example of the chips and using the violin vibration. So for those who have not watched our IdeaScale webinar of how NASA innovates with Steve Rader, I highly encourage you all to check that out. All right. Well, thank you so much, Nick, for sharing your insights with us today. It's always inspiring to hear your perspective. And thank you to everyone who joined us today for our first episode of CEO Chats. We're just getting started with this, so be sure to tune in every other Tuesday at 1 p.m. right here on LinkedIn Live for more exclusive innovation insights from Nick Jain. So we will see everybody next time. Thanks so much.